Hi, everybody, and welcome to Storms on the Way, an American Gods podcast. I'm Alistair Stevens, and this is the 9th session in our apparently occasional series through American Gods, both the novel and the Starz TV adaptation. In this session, we're returning our attention to the novel after missing out on last week thanks to a just calamitous piece of scheduling. Unfortunately, the schedule isn't much better this week, so this is going to be a brief session. I'm going to be in and out in an hour. I have a hard stop tonight because, well, I have other podcasts to record and other things to be done. So we are going to just look at Chapter 7 tonight, though that is not for a moment to suggest that there isn't a wealth of material contained within Chapter 7, which we urgently need to discuss. Our discussion of Chapter 8 will probably be folded into our discussion of Chapter 9 next week. More on that right at the end of tonight's session. Thank you all so much for joining me here. I should say, too, since people are already calling out in the YouTube chat, that yes, the title of tonight's session, also Shadow and Sam, is a joke based on my other podcast, There and Back Again. I should say one of my other podcasts, There and Back Again, an exploration of Tolkien's Middle-earth, in which this last week I discussed the first half of the second chapter of the first book of The Lord of the Rings, which is entitled, basically focuses on Gandalf telling Frodo the story of Sauron and the history of the ring. Thus, we are discussing the Shadow and, of course, introducing Sam Gamgee. That's pretty much where the parallel ends. There is an element within the plot named Shadow, a force in The Lord of the Rings versus a character in American Gods. But we do have two Sams. We have Sam Gamgee on the one hand, and we have, well, a curious teenage girl who we will be introduced to in the course of Chapter 7. A really interesting character, and a character which, for all of her, I don't want to say irrelevance, but her tangential connection to the plot of American Gods absolutely captures the hearts of readers, no matter who you talk to. I think a lot of people would consider Sam one of their favorite characters in all of American Gods, despite the fact that she is not particularly pivotal. This is, I would hesitate to say this is her most important appearance, but this is perhaps the point at which she intersects with the plot most powerfully, most forcibly, and even then it's barely, much of a presence at all, but she is staggeringly engaging. We just adore Sam, so we're going to talk a little about her tonight. Sams are always great, says Valerie. I have a theory, in fact, that supporting characters named Sam, yes, always good. Excellent. This is interesting from Sarah Thomas. Sam is such a Sandman type character. She's awesome. I don't know if anyone has been coordinating this. If you have been coordinating this and you're in the YouTube chat, then please speak up because I would like to shake you by the hand. But I have had a rush of support over the course of the last week for some kind of series looking at Neil Gaiman's series Sandman, his comic series, which I would love to do. I mean, that is just a huge undertaking. That is a vast and complex piece of work. I think I might step into Neil Gaiman's comic work with a little more caution and a little more care. I'm very committed to discussing his series 1602, his Marvel series 1602, as a part of my comic book and superhero podcast Excelsior, which I record with the wonderful Sarah Kate Pizant and the equally wonderful Vinton Bain. You can find that over at Common Room Radio. I would love to discuss 1602 because it's a genuinely fascinating piece of work. Of course, you would expect nothing less from Neil Gaiman. Because I only have an hour, I'm going to try and move directly into this discussion, but I couldn't move into the discussion without highlighting a couple of tweets that I received earlier today. Tweets from Lucky_LaD on Twitter, who is just wonderful, just a joy to have in your Twitter feed. So I highly recommend that you follow her first of all. But she pointed out, just notice that thus far, American Gods talks about tech like only new tech counts. Shadow uses a payphone, technically technology. Wednesday talks about sending telegrams, also technology. This is oriented, I guess, more toward the TV adaptation than the novel, but it does speak to something very interesting about Technical Boy. It does speak to something very interesting about our understanding, our conception of, I guess, capital T technology. Because capital T technology is separate from lowercase t technology in that we attribute to it a kind of unity, first of all, and certainly a kind of pervasive self-awareness. I think that the reason that Technical Boy is a product of the information age, is a product of the computer age, is that the advent of the home computer was the point at which technology stopped feeling like something that was completely under our control and started feeling like something other. Technology began driving progress in a way which was not, it seemed, and may actually have been, not entirely under human control. Technology became, to some degree, to some extent, self-aware. And that's fascinating, particularly because, of course, we're going to discuss chapter 7. And though I have talked about Sam, I haven't yet mentioned Media, who appears for the first time in this chapter, and also seems to be somehow representative of the point at which media became a force out with our control. And I think that this is crucial. I think there is a vital nuance here to be discovered and discussed. And it is simply that we cannot something which is of us. We cannot believe in something which is under our control. We cannot conceive of or manifest faith in something which is completely understood. In order for us to believe, in order for us to create gods through that believing, there has to be an element beyond the fringes of our understanding. We have to be able to attribute to that thing, either to that God, to that force, to that supernatural character, that supernatural figure, that phenomenon. We have to be able to attribute to it a kind of supernatural power, something which is not understood, but which is clearly manifest. That wasn't true, I would argue, through much of human history when it comes to technology, through much of human history when it comes to media. The point at which these new gods are enkindled is the point at which their archetypal representation outpaces our own intuitive understanding. We sense that there is something about, people talk about technology as though it is a force, as though it is a thing that is driving human culture, a thing that may be in conflict with human culture in certain regards. People talk about the media as though it is a thing which obeys its own rules, which has a sense of its own awareness, which certainly has an urge toward its own self-preservation. So I'm fascinated by this, Dee, and I'm very grateful for you kind of highlighting it so beautifully and succinctly. This is definitely something that we can track as we discuss media in this chapter and as we move forward into a greater discussion of the new gods in the chapters to come. You can, of course, contribute to this conversation, as Dee did through the course of the week on Twitter using the hashtag StormsOTW, STORMSOTW, or you can contribute live. If you are lucky enough to be here with us live, you can contribute right here in the YouTube chat, as so many people already are. This is wonderful. Tamara here is jumping ahead to chapter 8, asking, who is Sam? Is this Catgirl? Well, we'll get to Sam. It's not, but it's fine. Yes. Oh, we're talking about Delirium. Oh, you guys, Sandman is really good. If you enjoy American Gods and you enjoy Gaiman's novel work, I would urge you, even if you haven't already read a comic book before, even if you are not particularly comics literate, I would absolutely urge you to pick up Sandman. You may need to pick up, was there ever a definitive annotated edition of Sandman? If there was, then you should definitely pick that up. If not, there are websites out there that will kind of guide you through the process. You might need a little onboarding process. It's not a particularly accessible work, but it does in all other conceivable ways deliver that Gaiman goodness that we all yearn for. Yes. Tamara says, I read chapter 7 2 weeks ago. I'm terribly sorry for the delay last week, you guys. It really wouldn't have been good if I had tried to force it. Kate says, you know who felt technology was moving too fast and was monstrous? Every generation since the Industrial Revolution. Kate, I get the spirit of your response there. This was not a phenomenon that appeared for the first time around the Industrial Revolution. You can go back into ancient Rome and find people complaining about the advent of technology, complaining about technology moving ever faster and faster and faster. But still, I feel as though we incarnated technology, we othered technology. I feel as though even up through the middle of the 20th century, where obviously technology was a huge and manifest threat to many of us, you know, as you're coming up into the Cold War, technology is incredibly dangerous and could result in the end of our species, could result in the destruction of our entire planet. And yet it still felt as though technology itself was under the control of people. And therefore, technology, capital T, was not the threat. Crazy people were the threat. You know, dangerous political outliers were the threat. But I feel as though with the advent of computer technology in like the late 1970s, or obviously, okay, I'm going to frame this here, not the advent of computer technology in the late 1970s, obviously computers had been around for a while, but the advent of home computer technology in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and particularly the advent of the internet in the late 1980s, early 1990s, that this was the point at which technology became something other. And I would speculate, though I don't recall, if we actually get a definitive perspective on this within the pages of the book, I would speculate that that is when Technical Boy awoke, if we can use the word awoke. Okay, let's get into our discussion of Chapter 7 here with our introduction to Chapter 7. This is our little epigraphic paragraph right here at the beginning. Let me share this with you. As the Hindu gods are immortal only in a very particular sense, for they are born and they die, they experience most of the great human dilemmas and often seem to differ from mortals in a few trivial details, and from demons even less. Yet they are regarded by the Hindus as a class of beings by definition totally different from any other. They are symbols in a way that no human being, however archetypal his life story, can ever be. They are actors playing parts that are real only for us. They are the masks behind which we see our own faces. Wendy Doniger O'Flaherty, Introduction, Hindu Myths, Penguin Books, 1975. I will say, for the purposes of clarification, that this is a real book by a real author. This was part of Gaiman's research into the customs of gods and the structures of belief and the kind of life cycles that we generally attribute to gods. And what I find here most fascinating and most eloquently depicted here is this idea that gods are not necessarily what we in the West think of as gods. In the West, we carry with us very, and I'm using West in its most kind of generic and stripped of, you know, political weight and import sense here. But in our shared cultures, most of the people that I'm speaking to here occupying parts of that same shared culture, I should say, we generally associate gods with, you know, a monotheistic tradition in which we're talking about omniscience and omnipresence, and we're talking about this kind of infinite creative faculty, or we're looking back at kind of classical myth. We're looking back at the ancient pantheia of the world now gone. We're looking back at Greece or at Rome or to the Norse myths, for example. But there are other kinds of perspectives on gods which are, if not outright incompatible, then at least substantially different from those perspectives, our shared perspectives. And this is a crucial one. The idea that gods are not particularly powerful, the idea that gods are not particularly different from us, but they are instead archetypal, is enormously fascinating within the pages of American Gods. And I wanted to talk a little about this, as Aaron says here in the YouTube chat, uberhuman. Yes, kind of, though in a sense less than human. They don't have the same complexity and depth and agency that we would usually attribute to human beings. They are archetypal, as it says here, in a way that human beings can never be. And of course, this is particularly apposite because we've been describing shadow in particular in archetypal terms ever since the beginning of the book. Gods represent a face. They represent a mask. They represent one single defined thing. And that can never be said of human beings. Human beings have the capacity to change, but as we've discussed before, it would seem as though gods and, okay, also, one of the things that this paragraph serves to do is to broaden our definition of gods. We were discussing in the episode of Storms on the Way, which dropped last night, about, I say we, myself, Daphne Olive, Elizabeth Stevens, we were discussing the third episode of the TV show, and we got sidetracked a little bit by talking about Mad Sweeney and by talking about what is and is not a god. And this paragraph offers an interesting perspective on that, because it is possible that a god is simply an archetypal being fueled by belief, a being that is representative of something observable or something believed in, something elemental in its force, which is powered by belief, is kind of constrained by that belief. And that would apply, therefore, not just to gods in the classic sense, not just to Ibis or to Odin or you know, Chernobog even, you can argue, but also to kind of demigod figures, sub-god figures, characters like Mad Sweeney, characters like the Zorias, for example, who are not technically, according to the definition, gods, and who would not have attributed to them the kinds of powers that we normally attribute to gods, but are nonetheless apparently still fueled by and constrained by this structure of belief. But this note about archetypalism sent me down another path too, because I've been thinking about the ways in which the experiences of gods in the New World, the experiences, if you will, of these American gods, is somehow archetypal, not just in terms of their role, but in terms of their actual experience. We talked before about how authentic Chernobog story, the Zariah's story, feels to a, kind of archetypal Eastern European immigrant story. In this chapter, or, appended to the end of this chapter, we're going to get a perspective on a very different kind of immigrant story when we're talking about Salim and the Ifrit. We're going to look at a different immigrant story, which is nonetheless archetypal, which is nonetheless very powerful, which is nonetheless kind of narratively comprehensive. And I'm wondering at this point, to what degree the gods who are conjured are not just themselves, in and of their personality, in and of their power set, defined by that belief, but how much their experience as they move through the world is also defined by that belief. This is particularly true of Bilquis. Bilquis is the character that I've been thinking about most in this regard because, of course, a character who was enormously powerful and deep and complex in Africa has now been transformed, has been depowered, has been robbed of her power, robbed of her agency, robbed of her sophistication and her complexity, and rendered simple and voracious and kind of disenfranchised from society too. And obviously these are very difficult topics upon which we should tread extremely carefully, but it seems to me as though there's almost something archetypal in that experience too. Not definitive. I would definitely, want to pause here and separate this idea of archetypalism from any kind of notion of definitivism. This is not to say that all Eastern European immigrants had the Zariah Polochonaya, experience, a specifically bad example. Okay, not all Eastern European immigrants, not all Slavic immigrants to the United States had the Chernobog experience. Not all, well, Wednesday still escapes kind of careful definition there, but this is something else to keep in mind as we move forward. We are somehow talking about Batman and Superman here in the chat. This is excellent. Let me see as I'm scrolling back to find the root of this. So Christopher Nolan's Batman would be a god in this world. Interesting. Yes. One of my great arguments in favor of comic books is that comic books provide us with a modern and singularly, almost uniquely okay. Again, I want to hesitate and refine what it was that I just said. Superhero comics in the Marvel and DC tradition give us a contemporary mythic structure, which is not at all dissimilar to the kinds of mythic structures that we observe in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome. These are archetypal stories told and retold again and again and again and again and again. There are innumerable different versions of Batman, of Superman, of Wolverine, of Spider-Man. There are innumerable different versions of these characters, and yet somehow we manage to synthesize from those innumerable different versions a kind of core archetypal concept in exactly the same way as we can wade through innumerable versions of the story of Hercules, for example, and kind of come out the other end with a sense of this mythic figure. I think that superhero comic books here in the US absolutely fulfill many of the same functions as classic mythology. And when Gaiman is undertaking his mythopoeic act of creation within the pages of American Gods, as he is himself trying to create and trying to weave a comprehensive, accretion of myth, trying to weave a mythology for America that feels as though it has accreted from various sources, as though it is a living, kind of vibrant, kind of ever-evolving document in exactly the same way as, the pantheistic mythologies in particular were, and to some extent are. I think it's interesting that he steers away from those elements in American culture which kind of nod in that direction. And certainly, I think that superheroic comic books are among the most impactful of those creative elements, Yes, I guess I can't get sidetracked with this because I still have chapters to get through. But yes, this is fascinating. Let me see. Yes. We're discussing the aspects of gods here. Let me see. I can't find the root of this, but we are talking about different aspects of gods. As Sarah says here, for me, these are aspects of gods, not definitive. The god. And Aaron throws in, remember when Shadow sees the gods from the carousel for the first time, he sees many different forms at once. Yes, though the limits of that are unclear. The limits of that are uncertain. And for those who watched the third episode of the TV adaptation, it seems as though we're approaching this topic specifically from a slightly different perspective, or if not an incompatible perspective, at least a more refined perspective than in the pages of the book. Okay, I'm a third of the way through my running time. I have a million slides left to go. Hey, what do you say we get to the Raven? The dead fawn lay in a glade in the shadow of a hill, and a black bird the size of a small dog was picking at its side with a large, wicked beak, rending and tearing gobbets of red meat from the corpse. Its eyes were gone, but its head was untouched, and white fawn spots were visible on its rump. Shadow wondered how it had died. The black bird cocked its head onto one side and then said in a voice like stones being struck, "You Shadow Man." "I'm Shadow," said Shadow. The bird hopped up on the fawn's rump, raised its head, ruffled its crown and neck feathers. It was enormous, and its eyes were black beads. There was something intimidating about a bird that size, this close. "Says he will see you in Cairo," talked the raven. Shadow wondered which of Odin's ravens this was, Hugin or Munin, memory or thought. "Cairo?" he asked. "In Egypt." "How am I going to go to Egypt?" So this is our introduction to one of Odin's ravens. And we can note immediately, of course, that Shadow doesn't question this. After Shadow's experience, he now has no doubt who Wednesday is, and is freely associating with Wednesday those elements of his mythological framework which are not explicit in the text of American Gods. He's pulling in the stories that he has heard, the stories he has been told, certainly. I mean, we have had reference to the ravens before, but he's pulling in these elements freely and apparently without hesitation. So this is the moment where Shadow is set upon his path to Cairo in Illinois, in, I guess, Egypt in Illinois. There's a little bit of deceit, a little bit of deception here. Gene is anticipating my next movement. Yes. Gene says, "I love the clear call out to the Americanization of names common in cities across the country." This is one of the most delightful things in this entire chapter. Lauren here is calling out separate topic. "The mispronunciation of place names in that part of the country drove me crazy when I lived there." Not just in that part of the country. In upstate New York, there is a town named for Milan in Italy, which is referred to as Milan. This is common all over the United States, all over the United States. When I lived on the banks of the River Ohio in southern Ohio, right outside of Cincinnati, we were just down the road from the town of Moscow, I guess, as Americans pronounce it, though in that part of the world, it was oftentimes referred to as Moscow, which I found very familiar because that's how we pronounce the name of the Russian city in Britain. But here in the United States, hey, you live by different rules. Lauren says, for me, it was, I'll say Versailles, Kentucky, which is pronounced Versailles. Yes. There's a Michigan town, says Kate, spelled Charlotte, but pronounced Charlotte. I guess there's an emphasis there that I'm losing there. Yes. It is, I mean, this happens all over the world, of course. This has happened ever since we started giving names to places, but because of the combustible mix of different ethnicities immigrating to the United States, moving into the United States and spreading out across the United States, and those two distinct parts of the immigration process, they have kind of run into each other in more forceful ways. So it becomes all the more exaggerated. Yes. Good. Sarah says, "You guys, we have an island close to town that is called Monaco, but everyone calls it Monaco." I hope I'm pronouncing that with the emphasis on the right syllable there, Sarah, because that's rather delightful too. It is just wonderful. And we'll get this pulled even further. In fact, let's move on to the next slide, and then we can talk about the next part of our discussion. The raven flew up and away. Shadow looked at the corpse of the baby deer. He decided that if he were a real woodsman, he would slice off a steak and grill it over a wood fire. Instead, he sat on a fallen tree and ate a Snickers bar and knew that he wasn't a real woodsman. Excuse me, I want to get the emphasis right here. Instead, he sat on a fallen tree and ate a Snickers bar and knew that he really wasn't a real woodsman. The raven cawed from the edge of the clearing. "You want me to follow you?" asked Shadow. "Or has Timmy fallen down another well?" The bird cawed again impatiently. Shadow started walking toward it. It waited until he was close, then flapped heavily into another tree, heading somewhat to the left of the way Shadow had originally been going. "Hey," said Shadow. "Hugin or Munin or whoever you are." The bird turned, head tipped suspiciously on one side, and it stared at him with bright eyes. "Say never more," said Shadow. "Fuck you," said the raven. It said nothing else as they went through the woodland together, the raven in the lead and flying from tree to tree, the man stomping heavily through the undergrowth, trying to catch up. It is rare that a single slide can give you two of the most commonly appointed favorite lines in the entire book. That first paragraph I have seen referred to as a favorite passage, and then, of course, "Say never more, fuck you," said the raven. What we're getting here is a sharp contrast, even now, even after Shadow's fulsome entry into the world of mythology, the world of the gods, we're getting a stark contrast between the elements of the supernatural and the elements of the mundane. Here, he decided that if he were a real woodsman, he would slice off a steak and grill it over a wood fire. Instead, he sat on a fallen tree and ate a Snickers bar and knew that he really wasn't a real woodsman. First of all, we have to question the concept here of the real woodsman and where that concept comes from, because that seems to be, again, a quintessentially American ideal. He's not talking about a woodsman in the medieval sense. He's not even necessarily talking about a woodsman in the romantic Victorian sense. He's talking about this notion of the hardy American woodsman. He's talking about a almost quasi-survivalistic approach to living in the woods. But he is not that. He has this concept, but he is not that. So he sits down and he eats a Snickers bar, which is, of course, representative of all the disposable, forgettable, mass-produced food that we've discussed previously. And that is a trait, that is a motif, if you like, that runs throughout this book. The idea of disposable food versus the idea of food that matters. Food that is, as I've said before, mythic, food that touches food that is in the first place a product of its culture and food that thereby reinforces its culture. No one can say that of a Snickers bar. A Snickers bar, delicious as they may be, those things are only ever going to be disposable. They are, food units, as opposed to something that is more carefully created, something that is more prized, something wherein the experience of eating is as powerful as it may be. Kate says Ron Swanson would slap the Snickers out of his face. Yes, good. Skipa, who is in the chat. Hello, Skipa, says the number of Americans who pronounce the city in Scotland where I lived as if it rhymed with cow really bugged me. Glasgow, just saying. Yes, though if Americans mutilate the word Glasgow, they do even worse with the word Edinburgh, in my experience. Yes. Becca says, stop trying to make Nevermore happen. It's not going to happen. That is the Mean Girls reference that just keeps giving and giving, isn't it? I mean, Mean Girls is a great movie, and not a movie I expected to discuss even in passing during a Storms on the Way session. But the stop trying to make fetch happen is just, it's perfect. I use that way more often than I should, in all honesty. Yes. Sarah says, I hate to keep banging on about this, but hearty woodsman is a value in other countries. No, it certainly is. My suspicion here is that is not that the hearty, trivially, Canada definitely has a tradition of the hearty woodsman, perhaps even a more profound tradition, though crucially a slightly different tradition than in the United States. Scotland has a tradition of the hearty woodsman too. So do, I'm sure, innumerable other countries. But to me, it seems clear that Shadow is referencing here, because he is a product of his culture, he's kind of referencing, not Ron Swanson, not Nick Offerman, I suppose I should say, not that hearty flannel-clad man who can take care of himself out in the wilderness. That seems to be an element of American culture, or at least idealized American culture, in a way that seems appropriate for Shadow to reference at this point. Yes, this is certainly not meaning to limit that archetype to the United States, or to suggest that is in any way, an American archetype in origin. Certainly that's not. Australia has a huge tradition of, the hearty woodsman. So yes, it's not to limit it in that sense. It's just to suggest that this is perhaps descriptive for Shadow in this moment, but he's kind of falling back from that even in that moment. As Sarah says, New Zealand does. See my husband. I'm certain that your husband is the heartiest of all woodsmen, Sarah. Excellent. Good. As Aaron says, except England, if Monty Python is any indicator. No, there's definitely a tradition in England too. It's different. It's very different. Yes, there's a more kind of craftsman-oriented archetype in England, and I guess also you could argue the Robin Hood archetype, the kind of living alongside the trees, kind of living in that quasi-symbiotic relationship with the forest. That's part of an English tradition too. But yeah, yes. As Kate says, Shadow's not a lumberjack, but he's okay. All right, let's move on here. No, the reason that I wanted to highlight that last slide, besides the fact that it is fantastic, of course, is that it acts as an introduction to Shadow's journey south. And I wanted to call out the 3 examples here that we get of specific places. I guess 2 are given names: our town, population 720, and another town, population 300. Those introduce a 3-beat of welcome to this place road signs. The first, this is the passage: our town, population 720. The extra sign announced that the town's under-14s team was the 3rd runner-up in the interstate 100-yard sprint, or that the town was home of the Illinois girls under-16s wrestling semifinalist. Then in another town, we get the news that it is home of the runner-up to the state under-12 speed skating championship. 2 huge economy-sized funeral parlors on either side of the road. And how many funeral parlors do you need, Shadow wondered, when you only have 300 people? And then finally, he filled up the tank of the piece of shit in the town which was home to the runner-up of the state women's under-16s 300-meter dash. And then we get a description of the car too. And this is a fascinating perspective on these insular middle American communities, these Midwestern communities, where the desire to exhibit identity, the desire to claim that which makes you special, that which makes you unique, can lead you down some odd rabbit trails of discovery here, can lead you down some particularly niche paths in terms of local sporting accomplishment. Tamara is asking here, did Gaiman actually go on road trips to write the book? Yes, he certainly did. If you read the author's introduction to the author's preferred edition, which is also the 10th anniversary edition of American Gods, he gives a brief account of this, and certainly he's given in interviews a more fulsome account of his time in the United States, where he literally traveled from place to place. And as he was writing about a particular place, he would go there and try to inhabit that space. When Shadow moves, Gaiman moved to. I mean, that feels to me like a kind of mythology itself. I'm not sure how literally true that was, but certainly that's the story that is told. So yes, and he has, of course, personal connections with the House of the Rock, which we discussed back in Chapter 6 in Wisconsin, where Neil Gaiman, and apparently Neil Gaiman alone, is allowed to ride the carousel. That's a pretty big deal, you guys. It's a pretty big deal. Yeah. Okay. Yes, good. Oh, interesting. Sarah Thomas says sports grades being called under 14s, etc. seems not particularly American to me. That's interesting. Under 14s, under 12s, under 16s. That's curious because that doesn't stand out to me. But as I've said before, there are a couple of moments in the book where Gaiman's grasp of American English is imperfect, where it falters just a little. There are cracks and there are momentary fissures through which Britishness seeps. And this could well be a moment. I don't actually know that much about middle grade and high school sports, so I can't say for sure, but perhaps it would be, yeah, middle school champions or high school champions or something like that. That certainly feels intuitively more correct, given my, albeit limited experience of the United States. Yes, sure. Yeah. Lauren says, you're right, naming the middle or high school would be more likely. Sure. Excellent. Okay. Let's move on and take a look at... oh, I'm missing a slide here. That's a terrible thing. Oh, you know what happened was that my slides faltered right before I started the podcast, and I had right before I started the live session, and I had to rebuild them, and I have left one slide behind. So Shadow dreams. He dreams again of the Buffalo Man, and he dreams of this contract that he has made with Wednesday, the compact that he has made with Wednesday. And really the thing that I wanted to highlight is that Shadow is acting in accord with the compact that he has made with Wednesday. And when he is asked about it, he says, well, I drank the mead, so I'm doing this thing, which makes a dream logic sense, as it's called out in the passage. It makes a kind of dream logic sense, but doesn't actually map to real life. And I wanted to speculate a little and invite you all to speculate too, to what degree Shadow is actually under a kind of gist, to what degree Shadow is actually bound by the constraints of the compact. This is going to be so much more significant later, but even now we have the sense that he is following instructions when the smarter thing to do might just be to get out of town, might just be to leave and never think about Wednesday ever again. So to what degree is Shadow under influence? And then we meet Sam. I'm going as far as Cairo. Thank you, she said. I'm going to El Paso, staying with my aunt for the holidays. I can't take you all the way, said Shadow. Not El Paso, Texas, the other one in Illinois. It's a few hours south. You know where you are now? No, said Shadow. I have no idea. Somewhere on Highway 52? The next town's Peru, said Sam. Not the one in Peru, the one in Illinois. Let me smell you. Bend down. Shadow bent down and the girl sniffed his face. Okay, I don't smell booze. You can drive. Let's go. What makes you think I'm giving you a ride? Because I'm a damsel in distress, she said, and you're a knight in whatever, a really dirty car. You know someone wrote wash me on your rear windshield? Shadow got into the car and opened the passenger door. The light that goes on in cars when the front door is opened did not go on in this car. No, he said, I didn't. She climbed in. It was me, she said. I wrote it, while there was still light enough to see. This is less significant, perhaps, except that it speaks to this idea of place names being appropriated, of geography itself kind of warping and folding in upon itself. And that is enormously suggestive when we're considering this notion of American gods and the degree to which within the pages of this book, the degree to which within this conception of the United States of America, America is the world. That these two things are synonymous, in fact, that there need not be an outer world beyond the borders of the United States because the entire world has been drawn here and folded into this notion of Americanism, that the entire world is present here in a way that it isn't present anywhere else. And even these facsimiles of real places, Peru, not the one in Peru, the one in Illinois, El Paso, not the one in Texas, the one in Illinois, even Egypt itself, that these are, in a sense, excuse me for sneezing right in the middle of a podcast. I do apologize. There is a sense in which these places are the roadside attraction versions of those places, that they are facsimiles, yes, but they are somehow more representative, not representative of the places themselves. There's no sense in which, even El Paso, Illinois is a recreation of El Paso, Texas, but it is simply that names have been co-opted, that names have been reused, that names have been put to new purpose, and that in the putting to purpose of those names, we have, in a sense, recreated something of the original, that names still have power. So a distance down the road, the, yes, I've still never been to Hell, Michigan, says Kate Matt. So a distance down the road, we get a lovely beat where Shadow and Sam are going to eat and they're discussing who should pay for it. And Shadow offers to flip a coin and Sam checks the coin to make sure that it isn't a double-sided coin because, hey, she's been duped before, but she's never been duped by someone like Shadow, who, though the narrative doesn't explicitly call it out, we are certain has influenced, has rigged this toss of a coin so that he can pay for her lunch, so that this can be an act of generosity that she will accept, that she will be open to, because it is, of course, a function of chance, not a function of outright generosity. Yeah. Skipa says here in the YouTube chat, in my travels, I've met many people who are content to be where they are in America without a need to leave. Perhaps they get enough in places like Cairo, I guess, and Peru, Illinois. Well, I mean, in their defense, the United States is vast and does contain multitudes. As has been said many times, the United States is not a country, it is a collection of countries. It is a United States, if you will, to coin a phrase that's probably never been used before. These states are somewhat, to some degree, united. And there is a marked difference from Ohio and Wyoming and Massachusetts and Oklahoma. These places are different and were originally, of course, much more different. Federalism does seem to be a kind of a creeping and homogenizing force in the United States, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. As I've said before in previous podcasts, I am something of a federalist. I was a European federalist. I'm an American federalist. I believe that unity is good and is better than the alternative, but one of the consequences of that kind of unity is a certain amount of social and economic and cultural homogenization, and that may be something that will change with regard to the United States in the years to come, or will continue the path that we're currently on. Yes. Okay, so let me see here. Yes, we're calling out that lovely moment when he rigs the coin toss. It's Jean says, such a wonderful character building moment, and Becca says, I love Shadow. He's so sweet to her. I think this is one of the reasons that we like Sam so much, is that Shadow likes Sam so much, that it's such a natural relationship. I really love it. Then we get a very interesting perspective from Sam on what gods may be. So there are stories with gods in them. What are you trying to say? That these guys had hallucinations? No, said Shadow. That's not it. She chewed a hangnail. I read some book about brains, she said. My roommate had it and she kept waving it around. It was like how 5,000 years ago the lobes of the brain fused, and before that people thought when the right lobe of the brain said anything, it was the voice of God telling them what to do. It's just brains. I like my theory better, said Shadow. What's your theory? That back then, people used to run into gods from time to time. What Sam is referring to here is bicameralism. This is the philosophy, if I can put giant air quotes around that, even though you can't see me because the slide is still up, if I can put giant air quotes around the word philosophy and use that word then to describe bicameralism, this is the notion of two-chamberedness. It is a hypothetical construct in psychology that was argued by Julian Jaynes in a 1976 book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And he makes the case within this book that a bicameral mentality was the normal and ubiquitous state of the human mind as recently as 3,000 years ago. This hypothesis is somewhat crazed, was somewhat provocative and unorthodox and not widely accepted in 1976, is even less so now. But the idea here is that one half of the brain is issuing instruction and the other half of the brain is following instruction. And the full kind of suite of cognitive functions were divided cleanly between the two lobes of the brain. There is basically no evidence to support this. It's just speculation. But it does lead crucially to, well, a kind of biological dualism, which if you've read any Descartes, if you've ever spent any time reading about the separation between mind and body, between spirit and body, I suppose, this inner sense of self, the me that is continuous even when my body is resting, and the flesh that surrounds it, the discontinuity between these two things is philosophically absolutely fascinating. Descartes had some very strong and carefully thought out ideas about that kind of dualistic supposition. So the notion that gods may arise from within us biologically is not a new one. It is something that has been around for a long time, and it's something that is refined and refined and refined, that we continually kind of return to this dualistic notion. But it stands, of course, in stark contrast with the perspective of gods that were given in the pages of American Gods. So this is Sam not kind of highlighting a ready explanation for what is happening here, and certainly Shadow doesn't believe her. Gods are real. He has, at this point, come to that inescapable conclusion. But it is Sam kind of doing what human beings try to do and trying to rationalize this experience, trying to understand this experience in a strictly human frame, in a way that preserves our place at the pinnacle of experience, that preserves our spot right at the top of this hierarchy. We are so great that we can create gods through a function of our biology or a function of our neurology. That is not true, but within the pages of American Gods, there is a kind of force there. We are so great that we create gods through belief. And the removal of gods from the top of any kind of hierarchical structure of existence is profound. There are profound consequences there, which will be significant later in the book as we really look at the distinction between the innate and inevitable conflict between humans and gods. Yeah. Okay, let's keep moving. Because it's 8:45. Still got a lot to cover, you guys. Okay, so let's move on to our next slide and get to it. Yes, we can certainly get through this. I may need to put off the Somewhere in America and talk about Salim and the Ifrit next week, but we can definitely, definitely talk about Lucy. The picture dissolved into phosphor dot fuzz. When it came back, the Dick Van Dyke Show had inexplicably become I Love Lucy. Lucy was trying to persuade Ricky to let her replace their old icebox with a new refrigerator. When he left, however, she walked over to the couch and sat down, crossing her ankles, resting her hands in her lap, and staring out patiently in black and white across the years. "Shadow," she said, "we need to talk." Shadow said nothing. She opened her purse and took out a cigarette, lit it with an expensive silver lighter, put the lighter away. "I'm talking to you," she said. "Well?" "This is crazy," said Shadow. Like the rest of your life is sane? Give me a fucking break. This is media. This is our introduction to the second of the new gods. This is our introduction to a character who is, in her way, I would argue, the most archetypal of the new gods. Whereas Technical Boy is a product of something that is unseen and partially understood, misunderstood, even something to which we attribute supernatural power, even when supernatural power is not necessarily present. Media is very different because media is something with which we are all familiar. Media gains her power to the degree that she has power. This so far remains unseen because we are consciously aware of her. Yeah. Oh, Gene is calling out here. We skimmed past it, but I just adore the beat of Shadow waiting until Sam was safely inside. My parents and my friends' parents used to do that when I was a kid. Yeah. Shadow's the best. Shadow's the best, you guys, and his relationship with Sam is just lovely. Let's move on to the next slide, actually, because this will give us our perfect example of what media is and how she works. They underestimated you, sweetheart. Not a mistake I'm going to make. I want you in my camp. She stood up, walked toward the camera. Look at it like this, Shadow. We're the coming thing. We're shopping malls. Your friends are crappy roadside attractions. Hell, we're online malls, while your friends are sitting by the side of the highway selling homegrown produce from a garden cart. Now, they aren't even fruit sellers. Buggy whip vendors, whalebone corset repairers. We are now and tomorrow. Your friends aren't even yesterday anymore. It was a strangely familiar speech. Shadow asked, "Did you ever meet a fat kid in a limo?" She spread her hands and rolled her eyes comically. Funny Lucy Ricardo washing her hands of a disaster. The Technical Boy? You met the Technical Boy? Look, he's a good kid. He's one of us. He's just not good with people he doesn't know. When you're working for us, you'll see how amazing he is. And if I don't want to work for you, I love Lucy. There was a knock on the door of Lucy's apartment, and Ricky's voice could be heard off stage, asking Lucy what was keeping her so long. They were due down at the club for the next scene. A flash of irritation touched Lucy's cartoonish face. Hell, she said. Look, whatever the old guys are paying you, I can pay you double, treble, 100 times. Whatever they're giving you, I can give you so much more. She smiled, a perfect, roguish Lucy Ricardo smile. You name it, honey. What do you need? She began to undo the buttons of her blouse. Hey, she said, you ever wanted to see Lucy's tits? This is vital to our understanding of Lucy. Of media. Yes, of Lucy. What is so fascinating about this for me is the way that media behaves, not just in contrast with the Technical Boy, though certainly that's a valid point of comparison, but also the way that she behaves in contrast with Wednesday and with the old gods. And this brings us all the way back to the discussion we had right at the beginning of tonight's session, this discussion of archetypalism, the degree to which gods are constrained as well as defined, limited as well as empowered by the belief that is poured into them, the belief that is lavished upon them. Belief here being somewhat representative of time and attention and focus. The belief here just being the human mind, I suppose. We see here that media is powerful. She can reach across time and space. She can warp this image to say what she needs it to say to Shadow, but she's also constrained. Here in the last paragraph, there was a knock on the door of Lucy's apartment and Ricky's voice could be heard off stage asking Lucy what was keeping her so long. They were due down at the club in the next scene. A flash of irritation touched Lucy's cartoonish face. She's limited. She's inhabiting this set, this stage, this production. She isn't all-powerful. She can warp and twist what is hers to warp and twist, but she cannot apparently create. And that's a crucial distinction. This is one of the things that seems to set gods apart from human beings. Human beings can invent. Human beings can push forward. Human beings can change, and gods, it would seem, cannot. Not even the Technical Boy. This goes back to our introduction of the Technical Boy earlier in the book, when, as I noted at the time, even his description is oddly anachronistic for the year 2000. He's following along after that first creative surge of belief. And one of the things that happened to me as I'm reading these passages is that I begin to sense a real tragedy here for the gods. The new gods, yes, but the old gods too. That they are the product of a force and a process which they didn't ask for. That they are the consequence of human beings and are always going to be dependent upon human beings for their life, for their existence, for their power, for their place. They are always going to be dependent, and they didn't ask for this. I find media to be a particularly tragic figure because, of course, media can't threaten in quite the way that Technical Boy threatens. The Technical Boy is present in the world. Other new gods, as we will see later, are, to an even greater extent, present in the world. They can act in the world through proxies. But media can't force, because that is not a part of her truest nature. Media can't exert will. Media can only seduce. This gives us the real power, the real heart of what might seem on the first reading to be a throwaway joke, the joke about Lucy's tits at the end of that last slide. This is not a joke. This is actually how media entrances and enchants, through provocation, through titillation, through that slightly illicit sense that you're seeing something you ought not to be seeing. This is true of media, capital M, and also, of course, media, lowercase m. This is the late 20th century media phenomenon. The landscape has changed utterly because of this kind of titillation and provocation. And I should say, too, this is not to suggest that, hey, before TV, everyone was pure as the driven snow. No. This goes back to, the Gutenberg Bible. This goes back to ancient scrolls. As soon as human beings could even scroll an image in the dust or on a cave wall, we've been making images designed to titillate and to seduce, images designed to beguile and to enchant. Media is, of course, a natural extension of that, a natural representation of that. How tragic. It is somehow small. Is this the limit of her capabilities? That's the limit of her power. Yeah. Yeah, Sarah says, I think the choice of Lucy ties back to the beginning of television. Media has been around. Media has been around, but media is also following along thereafter. I Love Lucy was, you think about, the finale of MASH got, I don't know, 200 million people watching it. That's an inflated number, but it is an absurd number that is completely unthinkable in today's fragmented media landscape. Nobody watches a single show. No large group of people watches a single show the way that they used to. When Cheers used to run, it would get like a 30% down. Like 30% of all Americans would watch Cheers live. That is impossible now. Like maybe the Super Bowl approaches numbers like that. Maybe, I guess not even election coverage, because election coverage is broadcast on multiple platforms and on the phone in your pocket and on your computer and everywhere that you can possibly turn. So even those kind of huge shared communal experiences aren't broadcast in that way anymore. We don't get that kind of attention anymore. You have to go back into the 60s for that kind of unified attention. There is a fair argument. I mean, if not Lucy, then who? Which figure in the American media landscape would have this kind of power? Big Bird? Mr. Rogers? Maybe? I mean, there are a handful, but no more than a handful. Lucy is absolutely representative of a time when all of American culture, essentially, within a rounding error, was facing the same direction, was focused on the same thing, was believing in the same thing. It's no surprise that her empowerment springs from that. But at the same time, I would note the anachronism. Just like Technical Boy, she is following along after that first creative surge of belief. It's, like I said, tragic in its way. Let me see what else we have here. 105.97 million, says Gene. Is that the number for the MASH finale? 100 million people? That is crazy. If that's not a made-up number, and the fact that I don't know that's a made-up number suggests that it's entirely possibly a real number. Yes. Good. Okay, let me see here. Yeah. Good. Excellent. Oh, this is interesting. Coming from Narnia, would Tech Boy and media now meld together as media and technology have melded together? Interesting. No, I would say not. obviously there are shared aspects, but it seems to me that media is, as I said, that seductive presence that we choose to invest ourselves in. She is beguiling in a way that Technical Boy is not. Technology is inscrutable in its way. It is that too cool for school, that cutting edge of hip, that constantly moving forward sense that technology is just beyond our control. It's just outside of our grasp. And if we just try to catch up, but by the time that we understand Snapchat will be gone. By the time that we understand, the new social media platform, it'll be gone. Technology is constantly marching ahead of us in that way. And there is an inscrutability to the Technical Boy that I think speaks to that. So in the same way that stories are defined not by their setting, but by their emotional effect, I would argue here that gods are defined not by their content, not by the specific things with which they are associated, but with the kind of the quality, the emotional tenor of that belief. Yeah, good. Okay. Oh yes, as Garrett says, the series finale of The Fugitive. That's another famously huge show. Yes. Good. Kermit the Frog, says Garrett, is the only alternative, but the Muppets were essentially fallen gods when this book was written. How dare you? I always believed in the Muppets. All right, let's move ahead. In fact, to our final, I've got 5 minutes left, less than 5 minutes left. So I definitely won't get to our Somewhere in America, but I can append that to the beginning of next week's session because we've arrived in Cairo. This is the very end of the chapter. Shadow has performed his little trick for the benefit of the girl and finds himself with an audience. And he says, "What did you think?" Shadow asked the dog, trying to put the little girl at her ease. "Was that cool?" The black dog licked its long snout. Then it said in a deep, dry voice, "I saw Harry Houdini once, and believe me, man, you are no Harry Houdini." The little girl looked at the animals. She looked up at Shadow, and then she ran off, her feet pounding the sidewalk as if all the powers of hell were after her. The two animals watched her go. The crane-like man had reached the dog. He leaned down and scratched its high, pointed ears. "Come on," said the man in the gold-rimmed spectacles to the dog. "It was only a coin trick. It's not like he was doing an underwater escape." "Not yet," said the dog. "But he will." The golden light was done, and the gray of twilight had begun. Shadow dropped the coin and the folded bill back into his pocket. "Okay," he said. "Which one of you is Jackal?" "Use your eyes," said the black dog with the long snout. "This way." They began to amble along the sidewalk beside the man in the gold-rimmed glasses, and after a moment's hesitation, Shadow followed them. The cat was nowhere to be seen. They reached a large old building and a row of boarded-up houses. The sign beside the door said, "Ibis and Jackal, a family firm, funeral parlor since 1863. We have, of course, already met Mr. Ibis. Kind of, but this is our introduction to him in the here and the now of the narrative, and it is enormously powerful. It once again changes our understanding. I mean, we've had the talking raven, but the raven in mythology talks. This is something that can be attributed not to the raven itself, but to Odin. This is a manifestation of his divinity, I suppose, to kind of roughly abuse that word. It's fascinating how that works, but this is something very different again, and marks our transition, I think, into the next phase of the book. I am afraid that I have run almost as long as I can. I definitely need to, yes, Lauren is calling it here, Jackal versus Jackal. I'm kind of putting the emphasis there on Jackal to make it stand out, because of course, this is an audio podcast. So as she says, it's another thing you have to see on the page versus audio. Yes. Good. Excellent. Guys, I am afraid I am out of time. This is going to have to do it for this session. Next week, in fact, let me show you the last slide that I have just to catch us up here. Next week, on Monday, May 22nd, I will be releasing our discussion for American Gods 104, Get Gone, which looks to be very interesting if you're keeping up with the Stars adaptation. And on Tuesday, May 23rd, we'll be covering, well, I guess the end of Chapter 7 and Chapter 8 and maybe Chapter 9. Let's see how far we can get, shall we? We may just be with American Gods for quite some time. I know that no one complains about that. That will do it, though, for tonight. Oh, do stay tuned over at Point North Media. You can head over to pointnorthmedia.com and subscribe to the newsletter if you want the update. You can head to twitter.com/pointnorthmedia and either follow that account on Twitter or look at the top pinned tweet, which will contain a link to the calendar. Or you can go to pointnorthmedia.com and click the podcasts button in the menu right at the top. That also, if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, has a copy of the calendar. That calendar is constantly updated. Anytime you go there, that will be the most up-to-date and recent information. So that will contain everything for next week's scheduling. Guys, thank you all so much for listening. I'm sorry that this is a little brief and a little rushed, but this is what they call in the business a hard out. We'll pick up with Salim and the Ifrit next week, I promise. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you all again soon.